Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Beth Piatote, Associate Professor of Native American Studies at UC-Berkeley. Her interests include Native American literature, history, law, and culture, Native American Aboriginal literature and federal Indian law in the U.S. and Canada, and Nez Perce language and culture. Piatote's book, Domestic Subjects, Gender, Citizenship, and Law in Native American Literature, was published in 2013. Piatote participated in the Colonial and Decolonial Connections Symposium held April 30th to May 1st, 2015. The symposium was organized by the Oregon Humanities Center's Indigenous Philosophies Research Interest Group. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and of course, wonderful to be back at the University of Oregon.
Yes, and nobody knows, but it's a gorgeous day today.
It is perfect out. I can't believe it.
So your book, Domestic Subjects, focuses on a moment in U.S. history when U.S. military campaigns against Native Americans are in decline, but you argue at that moment the government opens a new front in the Indian Wars. Tell us about that front and what the weapons of it are.
Well, it's true, the military conflicts are receding, but the military doesn't go away. All of that power remains visible as they move into the next, and would continue to be used moving into this next phase of the assimilation period. And you know, one of the most important things I would want anyone to take away from the book is that Indian wars are wars on Indian families. And so the assimilation era in particular was a time in which the effort to Americanize American Indians was focused on removing children from their families, taking them to boarding schools, and breaking up the reservation into individual allotments. And so we were looking at these violent forms which were at one level administrative, the passing of documents, creation of land title, enrollment in a school, but at a human level were extremely violent and destructive. The severing of people from their homelands, the removal of children from their families and their entire kinship networks, and taken into very violent contexts with the boarding schools.
So you've already indicated that the book reads key works well, it reads particular U.S. laws and legal cases alongside works of Native American literature from the period. Why is that what you want to put next to the legal cases? Why is literature so important in your story?
Yes. Well, I think one of the things that the law does is try to separate and try to make these divisions very clean. Oh, we're just drawing this line here. We're just taking you to this school. Trying to make a line between what's Indian and what's American. But the process of doing that is a very violent process. And so in order to understand the process, the literature, so both law and literature are incomplete texts. They tell partial stories, but when we put them together, we get a chance at getting a fuller story. And so something that the law will do is try to separate an Indian subject from a non-Indian and make it very clear like who's Indian and who's not, that kind of thing. But then if you look at literature and you have like an interracial couple who love each other, but because of the way the law is structured aren't able to be together ultimately, then you see how messy and enmeshed and complicated subjectivities are, and how the law, which has no tangible existence between two people, can be a wall between two people or between multiple people. And so looking at them together helps us understand the site of the battle. Where's the site of contest? And in this period, the site of contest is on love, it's on connection, it's on identity and belonging and who you belong to and where and how, and what your sense of your national identity is, whether it's a tribal national or whether it's you know, American settler colonial national. And so both the law and literature have imaginaries that they're trying to construct. And when we put them together, we can see moments where they're in contest. We also see in the literature ways that Native people imagined differently, imagined other plots, imagined other resolutions, had to also work within the confines of a legal imaginary. So for instance, when I write about Alice Callahan, Pauline Johnson, trying to create a sentimental mother figure. The problem of creating a sentimental mother at that time is that legally and culturally, women were constructed as unfit mothers, which is why their children were being removed to boarding schools. They were also being constructed as hypersexual. And so there was no idea of the sentimental mother in the same way that it existed in sort of mainstream American literature. So here we see how law is directly limiting what is possible in literature. And the way that those authors got around it was through adoption. So you can have a mother who becomes a mother without any sort of sexual connection. At the same time, that lack of a sexual connection or a possibility is also like a price they had to pay to be able to even create that literary imaginary. Came at a cost.
So you're very attentive to, on the one hand, the agency of literature, but also the constraints under which the literature is operating and exerting its agency.
Yes.
So you mentioned two of the authors that you talk about in the book. There's a couple of others. You want to just tell us briefly who they are?
Sure. John Oskason, who's a Cherokee writer, Morning Dove, who's Okanagan, and Darcy McNichol, who's Salish and Cree. Those are the authors in the book.
So
yeah.
the period of the span of the literary text is from, say, 18 something to 19, say.
Yeah, so we tend to think of the assimilation period as 1879, which is when Carlisle Indian School opened, to 1934, which was the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act. And most of these authors fall within this period. The novel that I look at from Darcy McNichol was published in 1936, so it's just barely outside that period. It's set in an earlier period, so it still is addressing, books are always addressing their present moment, so that's the span.
So one thing that's really striking about the book's argument is how, in your account, the U.S. government's war on Indian family structures had implications beyond Native and Indigenous people. That is to say, these laws and their significance impacted white people. So explain that part of the story.
Well, whenever we look at what a citizen should be, we have to look at these different sort of racialized histories of exclusion and inclusion. So I think we can connect the experience of the assimilation period to debates that are happening right now, for instance, with immigration. And so when we look at the DREAM Act, it seems to have kind of neutral language about being an upstanding citizen. So if you meet this set of standards of being an upstanding citizen and having good moral character, those seem like things that are self-evident, but they've been created through a history of enforcing certain types of behaviors and expectations. And then part of the DREAM Act, too, is that if you were brought into the country through no wrongdoing of your own, no fault of your own, one of the things that act is requiring people to do is to accuse their own parents of criminality. My parents were the wrongdoers, I was innocent. And forcing people into, like, breaking apart the family in these languages of criminalization through fairly neutral terms. So those terms are never neutral. And even, the piece about housing, this concept of the single family unit, that seems like just things that planners talk about. But if we look at the laws that regulated Chinese immigrants in San Francisco, you have to have a certain number of square feet per person, and all of these sort of spatial normativizing structures. You can see, like, these different laws that have acted on people of color have been about creating these neutral terms under which we're all supposed to conform. So how does that affect the sort of citizen? It affects all citizens because no citizen is outside of these expectations. Many people haven't had to come up against them in the painful ways that immigrants or Native Americans have, but some start coming up against them once someone in their family enters the criminal justice system. Or even when we look at gay rights and things, sites where the idea of the family, what's in the best interests of the child. These are all neutral ways of talking about things that have very violent racialized histories. And so here's one piece of it that comes out of Native America. There are many other pieces of it that come out of the different labor histories, different child welfare histories. There are many moments of creating the citizen.
So you alluded briefly to a thing we were discussing before we started filming, so let me just bring everybody up to date. So it's a poem called The Housing Poem, and this is a poem that you discuss, you provide a reading of the poem in the conclusion of the book, and you explain that you use this in your introduction to Native American lit courses. So just tell us a little bit more about the poem so that our viewers appreciate the force of what you alluded to with that.
Okay. This is a wonderful poem by Diane Million, and it's called The Housing Poem, and it starts out with a single figure.
I have it here.
That's so good. Minnie. I was going to say Millie. Okay. So Minnie has this house, and it has a yard and flowers and this big cast iron stove, and pretty soon her brother and his wife show up, and as the poem goes on, the house becomes more populated with family members, and the grandma comes through. Pretty soon you have this small house that's just rocking with family activity, intergenerational. There's a baby, there's a grandma, there's a cook, everything is going on. But I do want to read the end of it. One night the landlord came by to fix the leak in the bathroom pipe and was surprised to find Minnie, Rupert and Anna, Sarah and Elsie, Shar and Dar all singing around the drum next to the big stove in the kitchen, and even a baby named Lester who smiled waving a big greasy piece of dried fish. He was disturbed. He went to court to evict them. He said that the house was designated for a single family occupancy, which surprised the family because that's what they thought they were.
So what do you do in your undergrad class with that?
Well, we talk about that shift. The landlord comes by, he was disturbed. And the idea that the Native family kinship system as a single family unit is a disturbing thought, both psychically and legally. And so the reaction to sort of this incompatibility is to go to court and create this eviction. And so we have this story of this one woman in this one house with the flowers in the yard. It seems like the dream of the Dawes Act, of the Native person becoming completely individuated, having the yard and the cultivation and the fence. It has all the things that the Dawes Act was trying to get at. So we see the resistance to that in the reconstitution of the family. But then again, we see the expulsion, and again, another set of removals that goes back to the Trail of Tears, that goes back to the Oneidas, that goes back to all kinds of different expulsions and removals that Native people have felt. There's this sense, though, that the family's going to come back together somewhere else. But it's that moment of disruption, and the ways in which it shows the neutralness of single family occupancy. It doesn't have race in it. It doesn't have class in it. And so students love this poem because it's amazing, great poem, beautifully written, and with this very sharp politics. And there are always students who say, this is what my family is like. And they're immigrants, right? Or they are first or second generation, or they're just families who have held themselves together from somewhere else. And they realize that they're always this far away from that expulsion, that the law is looking upon them in a certain way that's unacceptable.
So this poem makes clear that there are fairly profound continuities between late 19th and early 20th century representations in Native American lit of the sort of the complications and the pressures that are being put on Native families. Clearly there's continuities. Do you see differences between contemporary Native American writing around these topics from, do you find that there's more evidence? I mean, you said here that there's a sense that the family will endure, even though clearly, you know,
they're homeless at the end of the poem. Yeah.
Right. So what about that? I mean,
you know, I've tried to think. You know, this is a perennial question. What defines Native American literature? What do we say its characteristics are? And I do think that one characteristic, if I were to say there's something that carries through, is actually this sense of it's not over. And you know,
despite all the mythologies of it being over for so long in American history.
Right. There's a constant pressure in American history to say it's ended, it's over, it's fixed. Conquest is over, it's done. And I think one of the things you see in a Native imaginary, in this one and in novels and going back to the writing in the 17th, 18th century, is this belief like, no, the Indian Wars are still on. This is where it's happening. But it's not over. A lot of stories are still open-ended. Still, that's what I think one of the aesthetics and one of the main sort of pulsing ideas under Native American literature is that this contest is not over.
So this book is published in 2013. Your scholarly career is not over, so tell us what you're working on now.
I hope it's not over.
No, it's over. What's your scholarly work on now? I know it grows out of this project in some ways. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a bit about this too, this sense of colonization has never been complete as a project and has never been finished as a project. And wanting to think about how we can make visible that space in which colonization, that space of autonomy in which colonization does not have the same force and may even not even exist at all. That space outside of colonization. And so my next scholarly book project is called, right now, it's called A Sense of Autonomy, Native American Literature and the Legal Imaginary. And what I want to look at is try to get at this space that is outside of all the pressures and forces and expectations of settler colonialism, and also outside of the discourse of sovereignty and nationalism. Because I think that like Native American nationalism has been taken up in really important ways for its political edge. Like, we are sovereign nations, we have these rights, we are sovereign. But actually that is very important on the rhetorical level to the extent that it assures a set of rights. It becomes problematic in that we actually don't have full sovereignty. Like, whoever has the guns has the full sovereignty, not to be too crass about it. But we believe that full sovereignty is on the horizon. We will get outside of this someday. And we've preserved a space outside of it across time. And so the way of so when I talk about a sense of autonomy, it's this belief in some space outside. And also that there's something else, some other way we can imagine ourselves outside of the nationalist form. Because I think we generally don't think about nationalism as just okay, but we generally do look at the problems of nationalism and the way it forces certain types of subjectivities and exclusions and forms of belonging. Can we imagine ourselves differently as having other expectations and definitions of belonging and being? And so that's what I'm trying to get at. And the way I'm trying to get at it is by looking at the representation of the senses in literature. And so I look at the representation of synesthesia, the representation of sound, thinking about visuality and visions and dreams, and sort of a continuity across some different kinds of textual forms like the winter count, some non-alphabetic forms of history writing, wampum belts and things like that extend into representations of visions and dreams and that are part of seeing some other world, and then moving beyond that into thinking about other ways of representing the imaginary which includes sometimes speculative fiction.
Is there a body of Native American speculative fiction?
There is some speculative fiction, and it's not as robust as like Afrofuturism or things like that. But what I actually want to look at is Louise Erdrich's work, The Roundhouse, and its intertexts with Star Trek: The Next Generation. So I'm not really, I can say I don't really like do speculative fiction, but there is this very important intertext for the narrator and then in the structure of the book itself. And it is about like, can we think of other ways and can we work out these other possibilities? I mean, much of The Next Generation, which is actually the only sci-fi thing I've ever engaged, but I do really think it's important. You know, I really did like that series, and because it would work out all these social problems. And so even having a space to experiment is a luxury, I think, that Native writers and Native thinkers are like dreaming of. Well, where can we even work out some other possibility when we're so tied into these immediate needs to always be defending salmon, defending our treaty rights, defending, you know, these on the ground, trying to stop genetic modification of salmon. You know, it's like we're fighting so hard on these material grounds all the time. When do we get time to even like think about other worlds, you know?
You are a Native fiction writer as well.
That's true, but not speculative fiction.
Not speculative fiction. But I know that you are a writer of short fiction and that you have a manuscript that you're working on, which is a project on short fiction, original short fiction. Tell us a little bit about that project.
Oh, well, I think when I look at the early generation, well, I've always wanted to be a writer. I've always been a writer.
A creative writer.
A writer
Of
any kind of writer. You know, I started my career, I came to the U of O to do this master's degree in international studies where I could also take courses in journalism. And when I first came out of college, I thought, well, what's the best way to be paid as a writer is to be a journalist. So I got that training here. I worked for the Register Guard. I worked for the Associated Press in Portland. That sort of daily interacting with stories was really important part. For me, I cannot separate the metaphorical from the material, which actually made me kind of a bad reporter because I'd come back and be like, oh, this guy, you know, so I get sent out to do this zoning story, you know, and I'm like, oh, this guy got in trouble because his wife died and then he built this garden and then he turned it into a chapel, but it doesn't fit the zoning and it's like, it's about this love and then like reconstruction of grief, you know. And my editor's like, it's a zoning story, you know. But I'd always be like reading the metaphorical on top of like what was, but I can't think of things in any other way. To me, the metaphorical and the material are so deeply entwined. And I think maybe that's just part of being like Native in America. Like, have you seen a Sacagawea coin? That's like, can we strip those things apart? You know, because like, yeah. Okay, so. Where was I?
Your
fiction.
Your fiction.
Fiction is a place, you know, again, for working out things that, you know, the genre of academic writing maybe can't get at. It's also a place for me to tell stories of my world. And I think that what I see in these earlier writers too, like the metaphors and the aesthetics, everything they were doing was just representing the world that they were in, which is one that was intensely policed and legislated. And that's the world that we live in, you know, all still. So being able to write short stories and just tell stories about people I know and tell stories about what it is to be a Nez Perce person, to be connected to the Pacific Northwest. We have very specific aesthetics. You know, in my stories I like to use the number 5. That's a special number to us and to Yakimas and to other people in our community. So to be able to have a place to assert Native aesthetics that are really specific to my tribe and my region. And I think if there was anything I could do with my writing is I would want people to give people a space where they don't feel so lonely. For me, that's what Native literature did for me. So I find stories like, oh, I know these people, I know these plots, I know these problems. This is a world that I belong in, and I want to write stories that help people not feel lonely. So that's what my creative writing's about.
Eloquent. You mentioned you're Nez Perce, and you are involved with, seriously involved in the study, translation, and rejuvenation of the Nez Perce language. We've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Tell us about that part of what you do.
Okay. Native languages are so critical, and many of them are endangered. And I would encourage anyone who has any interest, whether they're Native or not, but especially Native people, to study their own languages or the languages where they are. Like, these languages need bodies to live in, and it's really important. The language has been an incredible source of learning for me and thinking, and also my aunt and uncle were first language speakers, and I feel very fortunate that I can be part of, carrying the language forward. And again, in the world of like, it's not over. We don't know how things will change. We just all have to pick up what piece is before us, and I feel very fortunate that that piece is in front of me, and I love reading and translating those old Nez Perce stories, and they're beautiful and wondrous. And I teach them to my students in Intro to Native American Lit. I make them do the morphology so they can understand, like, this polysynthetic language can do and create concepts that we can't have in English. Mm-hmm. So let's look at it through its own language and see how efficiently and beautifully it can express these ideas. So there are many ways in which the language is very important, and it's my contribution to giving something back to my community through the privilege that I have at the university and the kinds of resources we have to be able to support language programs back on the res.
So do you teach it to your students? I mean, you are instructing people who don't?
I teach people how to read it because that is my skill. Mm-hmm. And I teach them how to say good morning and, grizzly bear and stuff like that. Stuff you need to know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we mostly work with, we have sound recordings and we listen to them. We have the texts, we have the dictionaries. I show them how to translate the language, and then I hope that they go and learn more.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for letting me cut see out. Yeah.
I've been speaking with Beth Piatote, Associate Professor of Native American Studies at UC-Berkeley. She participated in the Colonial and Decolonial Connections Symposium held April 30th to May 1st, 2015 at the U of O. The symposium was organized by the Oregon Humanities Center's Indigenous Philosophies Research Interest Group. Thanks so much for watching.